So today we celebrate in our church Trinity Sunday, and we know that God is in three persons because of what we've celebrated last week, which is the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, which is in many ways the fulfillment of Jesus' mission, why he came. He said that he came so that the Spirit could come upon us. And so just as a lover reveals himself or herself to his beloved slowly and over time, so God reveals himself to us, first of all, to Moses and the Israelite people as one. But then we realize at the Nativity and probably even prior to that, as the prophets start to speak about the coming of the Son of Man, that God is in fact two persons. And then we realize, of course, as the Son comes and tells us that he will send his Holy Spirit, and then when the Spirit arrives at Pentecost, we now realize the fullness of God. And so he reveals himself in many ways completely to us with what we celebrate last week, which is Pentecost. So it only makes sense then today that we celebrate what we have come to realize about God ever since the Pentecost, which is the three persons in one God. Now that doctrine, as we've talked about many times, has continued to be developed, and we continue to hash out and unfold that more and more as a church each year and each day, as did the early church. But we know that God is three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but of one substance. And so, and again, that's what we celebrate then today as well. And really, it's the fact that in the Holy Spirit, really the Holy Spirit kind of acts as a tractor beam to pull us into the very life of the Trinity. A lot of times I think when we celebrate the Trinity and when we think of God as Father, and we hear that we are brothers and sisters with Jesus, that God has adopted us, we think that that's somehow metaphorical, right? Like we think that is, or we're tempted to think that is somehow mystical or colorful descriptions, but not the reality of the situation or the fullness of that. But in reality, again, God is the Father is our Father. Jesus teaches us how to pray and he says, here's how you are to pray. You are to pray, our Father, right? So he's saying that God the Father is our Father, right? St. Paul and others and Jesus himself tell us that God and that we are brothers and sisters with Christ. When we are baptized into the family of God. And so we are brothers and sisters with Christ. Mary is our actual mother, right? But then the Holy Spirit, again, really kind of acts again as that holy tractor beam to kind of pull us into the very divine life in the midst of the Trinity that we're meant to be dwelling in and living in. And so I think that, again, that there are a ton of people, right, who don't know that it is their destiny, their vocation to live on this side of heaven in the very Trinity itself, right? And within that firehouse, that oven of love that is infinite, and we can never fully get our arms around, but we're not meant to. We're meant to live in it, right? And I think there's always a temptation, right? Like to try and see ourselves, like to step outside ourselves and to kind of watch ourselves. And so, when we think about living, even those of us who are aware that it is our vocation to live within the Trinity and within the Trinitarian love of the three persons, that we're called to live in that, there can be a temptation, I think, as well to step outside that and try and watch ourselves in the midst of that love. But that's not possible, right? So we have to get over that desire to step outside ourselves and to see ourselves living in the midst of the Trinity, and instead to throw ourselves in completely and to allow ourselves to be consumed by the very fire of the Trinity itself. And so I think that when we look around the world today, like we see a world that is literally burning, right? Like, so our country is on fire. We're seeing a world that is in many ways coming apart at the seams, and I think that there can be a temptation, and it's not a temptation. A preacher might decide and discern, and I've done this many times, right? Like I've discerned that the church has something to say about this problem that's going on in the world today, that X, Y, or Z, whatever the day is, Columbine or Sandy Hook or any other issue that's come up in the last 11 years of my priesthood. There have been many times where I stand up and say, hey, the church has something to say about this, right? Including the racism that was taking place on DePauw's campus several years ago. Stood up and preached a homily that weekend about what the church says about racism. And the church has a lot to say about racism. And it is the heart, and it's hard to fathom a more objective evil, right? But I want to avoid and kind of take the 30,000 foot view today of the world and not speak about any specific sort of church teaching on whatever the issues are that we're seeing in our world today, whether it's racism or violence or looting or, etc. I want to paint a picture of, and you may already have it in your mind, but I want to paint a picture because I look around the world and I see a world that it's hard to fathom, a world that could be any closer to coming apart at the seams, right? I'm sure it's possible. I'm sure there are things that we haven't thought of yet that are possible for us to take further steps away from God. But again, it's hard for me to fathom a world that could be further from God than our world today. So when we look around and we see, right, like abortion and homosexual marriage, right, which again, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI just said, those are two signs that that the spirit of the Antichrist is moving in our own day and in our own times. Racism, right? Violence, people rebelling even against their own bodies. So men saying that they're men or men that are thinking that they're women, having surgeries, right? Like all of these things, and you could go down the list, right? In the ways in which the world is just kind of coming apart at the seams. And again, it's the church has something to say about each of those specific issues. But I want to posit today that the only way that we're really going to solve these problems, if we have any chance of solving them, is being people who see it as their vocation and as their call on this side of heaven to live in the midst of the Trinity. And so there are lots of people, again, who don't know that. There are lots of people who see God from the outside. And the Old Testament is full of reasons and stories and examples of God being an external God and having that fall apart and having that not work. Now, God in his infinite wisdom and in his infinite love had more in mind, and again, we see that and we celebrate that today. We celebrate the fullness of God's plan. But when we think about it, when we listen to that first reading, God's first coming to Moses, right, with the law and the covenant, and immediately after that law is given, the people are rebelling, right? And we've talked about that before. Seeing God as an external lawgiver has never worked, right? And it won't work ever, right? There's a part of us that will rebel against that will rebel against this idea that there's a person outside of me that is giving me laws. But if I can recognize that I'm, instead of that being the relationship of lawgiver and external that I can't know, if I can recognize that my vocation and that I'm called to live in the midst of love itself, right? Then I can be, and this world can be transformed. And until we recognize that, and until we realize that, it's going to be impossible for our world to put itself back together, right? But if, again, the world is, so the people that are going to save our world are saints, right? People who recognize that they are having been given an invitation to live in the midst of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who recognize the gifts that they are given, and who recognize that they are called to dwell in that and to not see it from the outside, but to just simply live and be immersed and transformed in that by that exchange of love that is taking place within the Trinity. Only that will have any shot at fixing our world.